Shalom. Welcome to Bible Interact. I'm Dr. Deanna Dye, and this is the second session in our Dew of Heaven series. This particular session is called Manna from Heaven. And in this session, we're going to look at the association between the dew and the manna from heaven that was brought in the wilderness when the children of Israel were there. This chapter, we're going to find an allusion to the atonement. It's not overt. It's not very obvious that there is an aspect of atonement. But as we go through it, I think you'll see that there very clearly is an element of atonement. From Psalm 68:9, it says that God, when you marched out through the wilderness, the earth quaked, and the rain poured from the sky at the presence of God. And even Sinai shook at the presence of God. Now this verse, according to the rabbis, is alluding to the incident at Mount Sinai, or Mount Sinai. And according to them, it says that when God appeared amidst the trembling of the earth on Sinai, life fled from the people of Israel, and from all the living people that were in the land of Israel. And the angel said, "Do you desire to give your law to the dead or to the living?" And then God dropped the dew of the resurrection upon all, and they revived. So once again, we see a relationship here between the dew and the resurrection of the dead. Now this, of course, is from the rabbinic literature, but we will see it as well in the Hebrew scriptures. This life-giving force that brings resurrection has to do, of course, with the Spirit. Now, if we were to look at Exodus 16, this is where we're going to talk mostly about the manna. I believe that the manna was reflected in the spiritual food to be eaten by Israel in a spiritual environment. Now, the manna was given in a double portion for the Shabbat, or for the Sabbath. And the rabbis say that he who prepares on the eve of Shabbat will have food on Shabbat. So manna becomes a picture of the food that's for the kingdom, or a food that's for the Sabbath. Now, if we go to John chapter 6, it talks a lot about manna here, that the manna that came down from heaven, and anyone who eats this manna will live forever. They will be raised up on the last day, those who eat that manna. That the resurrection of the kingdom, as I said in the last session, would come at the inauguration of the Messianic kingdom. Further in this particular chapter in John 6, it says that our fathers ate manna in the desert, and he gave them bread from heaven to eat, and that bread came down from the Father. So this bread that comes down has an association in some way with living forever, the resurrection of the dead, life in the eternal. Now we have two different periods or ages of existence, if you will. We have the present age, which is the time that we're living in now in our flesh bodies, but then we have a future age, what's called the world to come, in which we will be in resurrected bodies. It's the time period outside the dimension of time. And so God gives, in that chapter, Exodus 16, it says, God gives meat to eat, and he gives them the meat to eat in the evening, which to me reflects the time of the present age. He gives us in this age meat to eat. That is, meat in Hebrew is basar, gospel. That's what we feed on in this particular time frame. But in the future, in the age to come, when we are in resurrected bodies, God gives bread from heaven to eat, the bread or the manna from heaven, and that's associated with the world to come, the time of the resurrection of the dead. So meat becomes that which is essential for the physical body, and bread becomes that which is essential for the spiritual body. And even though we're in these physical bodies, our spirits have been regenerated. And so we are basically spiritual beings feeding on the bread of heaven, which of course also relates to the Torah, because Yeshua the Messiah is the bread of the Torah, the bread of heaven, and the personification of the Torah. Now, if we go through that chapter, we will see that the manna was only found in the morning. And to me, the morning is a picture of the kingdom. When day breaks, when it's day, it's a time of the kingdom. And when was that food for? It was for the morning time. And we would see in that chapter that the manna, when it appeared, it had a layer of dew on top of it. And actually there, if you read in Numbers 11, there was a layer of dew on the ground. Then there was this thin layer of frost, which was the manna, and then over the manna was another thin layer of dew. And so what we have basically is what I call a dew sandwich. Okay, so the dew is on the ground, and then we have the frost, and then we have the dew on top of it. And remember, everything that we're talking about here has to do with this idea of dew relating to the resurrection of the dead. Now let's look at the middle layer, the manna, which in Hebrew is man. In this particular place, they call it thin frost. Later on in the chapter, it talks about it being coriander seed, or like coriander seed. But right here, it describes that manna as being frost. And so when is the frost revealed? Well, first, the dew has to melt away and the dew comes in the morning. It's melted away by the sun, and there revealed is the frost. Our word for frost in Hebrew is kapur, and that is the actual word for frost because it means to spread out and cover. But it also has in it this idea of atonement, kapur, something covering, and that's what atonement is. The atonement was brought to cover our sins so that the wrath of God would not fall upon us. And so it says further that the dew rose up. When it was melting away, the dew rose up. So we have this imagery, again, of the resurrection, the dew rising up. Then we have the frost representing the atonement, and then we have dew again. So I equate this with the dew of the resurrection being the dew of Yeshua brought by his atonement, and then later the dew of everyone. That was the dew that was spread out on the ground. Now, this concept, I said, is very key, that we have an atonement with the resurrection, because no resurrection would take place had not an atonement occurred first. And so again in the passage, buried in there is a picture of the atonement of the Messiah, who would bring resurrection by his death and his burial, and ultimately his resurrection. Now further in that chapter, I'd like to take a moment and talk about the leftovers, because the leftovers and the gathering of the leftovers has much to do with the future kingdom to come, the Sabbath rest, the Olam Haba, the eternal kingdom that is coming. And what did they do? They went out and they gathered portions. They gathered one portion for each one of them, and they were not allowed to gather leftovers. If they did gather leftovers, that which was left over in the morning, worms would come in it. The only time they could gather leftovers was on the 6th day. And on the 6th day, they could gather a double portion. And that double portion, that extra portion, the leftovers, would be what they would eat for Shabbat. So there is an association between leftovers and the time of the kingdom, the time of the Messianic kingdom, the Shabbat. Now, if we look at the time frame here, we see that where they are in terms of the festival season is they are between Pesach, Passover, and Shavuot, Pentecost. And at the end of Passover, we have the time of the counting of the Omer. And what are they doing? They're collecting each one an Omer to provide for themselves for that day. So this is our time period. Now it's interesting, in the literature they talk about, in this particular period of time, something the rabbis call hurtful dews. It says, between Pesach and Shavuot, a prayer is offered that God may preserve the people from hurtful dews. The 2 loaves of bread offered at Shavuot are waved to and fro in symbolic petition to the ruler of heaven and earth and of the 4 winds to keep off the hurtful dews. Now, what are the hurtful dews? If we associate dew with resurrection, what are hurtful dews? To me, the hurtful dews have something to do with what we call in Revelation the second death. That is the resurrection of the wicked. So we do have 2 resurrections associated with the dew, the resurrection of the righteous and the resurrection of the wicked. And I believe that the hurtful dews have to do with the resurrection of the wicked. Now back to our story, they were commanded to collect each day an omer, and every day was the same. They collected the same amount and for each individual person. And I believe that is a picture to us of the atonement, in that the atonement has to be made by each individual on their own basis. It can't be, the covering doesn't come from anyone else or a group. You are required to receive the atonement individually. It's your choice. You receive it daily, basically. And just the same way that they collected the portions. Now the atonement came in this present age. and prepared us for the time of the resurrection in the future age. Now, I found a very interesting description of the per person portion in the Hebrew, and it's the word gulgolet. Now, that may signify something to many of you. Might remind you of Golgotha. It's the same word because it means skull, the place of the skull. And from the rabbinic literature, they had an interesting take on the dew and the skull, which I did read in our last program, and I'd like to read again from the Zohar. In the Golgotha sit 13,000 myriads of worlds, and from Golgotha dew drips upon him who is outside and fills his head every day. Remember, it's talking about Golgotha is actually the skull, something round, and so it's talking about the dew on the head or on the skull. And it also says from Song of Songs, my head is filled with dew, and from that dew which he shakes from his head, the dead will awaken in the world to come. So isn't it interesting that there is some kind of connection here between Golgotha, the skull, and the dew on the head, and what we saw at Mount Hermon in Psalm 133. And I believe that this could well be a picture of the place in which where the atonement took place, and that is Golgotha, the place of the skull in Jerusalem. Now, as I said earlier, they were allowed to collect per person a portion for each of the 5 days, and they could not have any leftovers. But then on the 6th day, they collected a double portion, and so on the 6th day, they did have leftovers for the Shabbat. That particular portion remained fresh, even though it was collected on the 6th day. So it could be indicating something to us that we certainly need to prepare on the 6th day for the 7th day, for the world to come. And we have 5 days in which they collected one portion, and on the 6th day they collected 2 portions. But of course, as we mentioned earlier, if they collected extra, if they gathered extra on the 5th days, the first 5 days, what would happen to the leftovers? Well, worms would come in. And that Hebrew word for worms, tolaim, actually means crimson. And these worms would be found in the leftover manna. Worms, of course, a picture of, you think of a dead body and decay and it being eaten by worms and maggots. And that's, of course, the state of affairs for our physical our bodies in this particular age. Isaiah 1:18 tells us, though our sins are like scarlet, they will be white as snow. Even if they are red as crimson, they will be like wool. Now this word tolat, the worm that we find in Exodus 16, is the dye, the red dye used for the color, making the garments of the priests and in the curtains of the tabernacle. Now how this works is very interesting imagery about the worm. This crimson worm is a female. She would climb into an oak tree and she would attach herself to the tree because she was going to produce her larvae in the tree. And the idea was that she would cover herself over the larvae and protect her children because after she produced, she would die. And so she wants to make sure that she's well attached to the tree, usually an oak tree, and her body would be the shelter for her larvae for the eggs to come. And once she lays the eggs and shelters them, during the birthing process, she would produce this crimson fluid, if you will, and this fluid would cover the eggs, and would actually leave a stain on the tree that would never fade because it was a dye. And so for 3 days, you could actually scrape the worm from this tree, and the dye or the crimson gel would be used as a dye. But then on the 4th day, the worm would somehow pull herself together in kind of a heart shape, and she would no longer produce the crimson dye. Instead, now she would become white as snow, and would produce a wax. And this particular wax would be seen as a preservative for the wood. What an interesting and fascinating picture of what Messiah accomplished on the tree by his shed blood and the stain that he left. And he dies and brings protection and salvation to his, what he produces, to his seed, to his ones that would be produced, and that he would cover them in the same way that the worm covered her young. And this idea of this covering, kapur, as we are covered from the wrath of God, because God he can judge us, but yet the covering that comes from Messiah's death protects us from the wrath to come from God himself. Now, I'd like to shift gears a little bit. We're going to move to the story of Ruth. And her story takes place at the time of Shavuot, or Pentecost. From Ruth 2:14, Boaz says to her at mealtime, "Come here, eat of the bread, and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed parched grain, which was barley, to her, and she ate, and she was full, and she had some left over. Now, this should immediately come to your mind. We've just been talking about leftovers. To come and eat, as Boaz said to her, was a idiom, if you will, to approach royalty. And so it says she ate, and the rabbis say that meant in this world, and she was filled. They say that meant in the time of the Messianic kingdom, and she had leftovers, indicating the time of the future age to come. This is from the Talmud, Shabbat 113b. Now let's talk about the grain for a moment. The grain that was used was barley. And the barley was supposed to be waved at the time of the counting of the Omer. It would be the morrow after the Sabbath, at the time of Passover. They would begin to wave the barley grain before the Lord. The barley grain was planted 70 days prior to Passover, and there was a special service on this particular day, the starting of the waving of the Omer, the counting of the Omer, the festival called Yom HaBikurim, or the Feast of First Fruits. And this is exactly the same day in which Yeshua rose from the dead. He was the first fruits of the resurrection. Barley very much associated with resurrection. So the temple priests would mark out a portion for the growing barley. And then on the eve of Yom HaBikurim, the Feast of First Fruits, they'd go out into the fields to their marked portion. And they would talk to the crowd and ask questions to verify the process that the barley had been through. And there they would reap what was called an ephah of barley, and they returned that barley back to the temple, where they would thresh the grain, and they would use rods so that they wouldn't damage the grain. And then they began the process of lightly roasting the barley over an open flame, and it was milled and it was sifted, and it went through this process over and over and over again, so that the barley flour was so fine you could literally put your hand in and pull it out, and there would be absolutely no flour on your hand. That was how fine the flour was. And this was in the morning, this was what they took, and they would wave the flour, the offering before the Lord, the first fruits of the barley harvest. Again, a reminder, the first fruits of the resurrection of the dead that Yeshua brought. Now, the other thing it says, which is interesting, is that they dipped a morsel of bread into vinegar. Now, vinegar was used to refresh people from the heat of the day. The Hebrew word chometz, which should sound very familiar to you, like chametz, leaven, is the same word basically. And so the harvesters would use vinegar when they were out in the day in the hot sun to cool them down. And so they would dip it to avoid sunstroke. And I thought, isn't that interesting that Yeshua on the tree was given the hyssop that was dipped in blood. Was dipped in the sponge into sour wine, or a wine that was fermented, and it was put to his lips. So perhaps an image here of his atonement bringing protection to us from the heat of the day. And what is the heat of the day? Well, the heat of the day is a picture of the wrath of God. And so he is a covering to us in this leavening, the chametz, the vinegar, from the heat of the day, which is the judgment of God. Remember, the children of Israel in Egypt would take the hyssop dipped in the blood, and they would put it on the doorpost to protect them from the heat of the day or the wrath of God. I believe this all is a picture of his work that was accomplished on the tree, and that the atonement is in fact our covering, our kapur, for the wrath of God and the sure judgment that is to come. And this image of the day and the bright is the time of the kingdom. And so there's an element of atonement there that is taking place, this protective covering. Now, switching over to John chapter 6, because this is a very interesting portion of Scripture. We've all read through it numbers of times, but haven't looked at it in quite this way, I'm sure, because they are approaching Passover. They have no food, and there's multitudes of people, and they don't know what they're going to feed the people. And a young lad shows up with 5 loaves of barley and 2 fish. And there's all these people, and they have them sit. It says that their men numbered 5,000, so we don't really know how many people there were altogether. So he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and he said the barakah, or the blessing. And the blessing would be for the bread. It's called the hamotzi, the bread that would come forth, that bread would be brought forth from the earth. And so the blessing was said, they passed out the food, and there was plenty for everyone, and in fact there were leftovers, our same word. So they were eaten, they ate, and they were full, and they had some leftovers. So they gathered up the leftovers. And I believe that the picture of the leftovers is a picture of the Sabbath, of the future kingdom, or the Olam Haba, or the age to come. That we eat in this present age, that we are filled in the Messianic age, but in the future age, in the world to come, in the kingdom, we have leftovers. The leftovers filled 12 baskets, which is kind of interesting if we relate that to the entire whole body of Messiah. Joining together of the complete house of Israel, 5 loaves of barley, from the 5 loaves of barley, and this is our spiritual food in the spiritual time. That the food for this age, as I mentioned earlier, was the time in which we eat meat, which is basar, which is the gospel, and in the food in the time of the age to come is the manna, is the leftovers, is the bread from heaven. Now the hamotzi, as I mentioned earlier, is the blessing that's said when you're going to eat bread, or we say when you're breaking bread. The actual breaking of the bread is the blessing. It's talking about bringing forth bread from the earth. We bless God for bringing forth bread from the earth. This is the breaking of the bread. And this particular prayer is understood to be an ancient prayer for the resurrection of the dead. So every time this blessing is said, we're to think about the resurrection that comes forth from the bread of heaven, the manna, of course, personified by Yeshua the Messiah. Isaiah 26:19 talks about, and the earth shall cast out the dead, shall bring forth the bread from the earth. And it was said that to offer a portion of bread was like offering a few drops of dew. Isn't that interesting? So constantly we have these relationships between the dew and the resurrection of the dead and bringing forth bread from the earth. If we were to look in Luke 24, I would suggest that you read the entire chapter. It talks about the Messiah had to die like this, that he had to die on the tree, just as a common criminal, but that on the 3rd day he would be raised from the dead, and that he took the bread and made the barakah. Blessed art thou, O Lord, our God, who brings forth bread from the earth. And that he broke the bread and handed it to his disciples, or his talmidim. So this breaking of the bread is the blessing, which is a reminder or a rehearsal for the resurrection of the dead. The one who says the blessing, the one who breaks, is the one who breaks the bread. And of course, there's going to be sharing a communal meal or Shabbat meal with the breaking of the bread. And it was then when he broke the bread and said the blessing, interesting, that their eyes were opened, and he became known to them in breaking of bread. I believe that they recognized the idea of him who would bring atonement, but then resurrection would come. In the breaking of the bread, they recognized the resurrection of Yeshua the Messiah. He was hidden, but then they saw. Now, if you can read also in Acts chapter 2, verse 42 and 46, it also talks about breaking bread and the prayer that's associated with it. That after the resurrection, of course, the Spirit is poured out. And isn't that what Acts chapter 2 is all about, is the Spirit being poured out after the resurrection of Yeshua the Messiah. Now I'd like to just look at a couple of verses to close here about the bread coming down from heaven. We can look in John chapter 6, verse 50. What does Yeshua say? He says, I am the living bread. That's the bread that gives eternal life. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats this bread, he will live forever. Again, this association with eating of this bread, this manna, the spiritual bread for the Shabbat, the bread for the kingdom to come. That's the bread in which we will have eternal life. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. And of course, he gave up his physical flesh to bring eternal life to us. And finally, in verse 53, Yeshua said to them, I tell you the truth, unless you can eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him. Just as a living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. So all this to show this feeding on the manna, the bread for the Shabbat, the bread for the kingdom to come, the bread that will come forth out of the earth, the idea of resurrection. There is a lot of an association here then between the resurrection of the dead and the manna that was in the wilderness. But first, of course, came the atonement, and once the atonement came, then the resurrection came. So in our next session, we're going to continue on this theme. We're going to talk about Gideon and Gideon's fleece, and we're going to relate the fleece with the resurrection again, and we're going to see in that passage, once again, how there is an element of atonement in there before the resurrection can come. Thank you. Shalom.